And welcome once again to another episode of Stiglr for the Details. My name's Alan Dickerson, known in some wargaming circles as Stiglr. And today I come not to praise Highway to the Reich, but to bury it. Um, I have seen this old SPI title mentioned in several um, web telecasts about the best of SPI, and I uh, I always kind of shake my head ruefully at it because, um, in the interest of full disclosure, I first bought Highway to the Reich back in 1977 or 78. Um, this was fresh off of the heels of the classic movie A Bridge Too Far coming out, and I saw that in the theaters, and I was really into the subject matter of Operation Market Garden, so this game was kind of a natural, and so I picked it up, and just because of the size of it and the complexity, I was never really able to do more than play some of the one map single scenarios for the game, which are great because you get to kind of focus in on either the 30 core breakout or any of the three airborne divisions, the 82nd, the British 1st, and the 101st U.S. Airborne divisions. And also, these scenarios focused on the historical drop zones. But when you're contemplating the uh, campaign game or the full battle game, there was the possibility that you could, uh, at your own peril, use alternative drop zones for the Allied airborne forces. So I kind of kept that in my back pocket for a number of years. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to organize or help organize a six-player game of Highway to the Reich with some local gamers here in Oregon, and we were able to get three. Or let's see, no, there were four Allied players, one for 30 core, one for each of the three airborne divisions, and then two German players, one basically north and south, and we were going to divvy up the operations area and play the full 106 turn campaign game. And I was just really, really enthused. And as fate would have it, we met on Discord for a couple of weeks. We're all coming back to the system, so we were having to relearn the rules, and we had meetings on rule clarifications and figuring out what was going on and all of that. And then we kicked it off, and in the space of the first half of the first turn, we discovered that the system is almost irretrievably broken. And I don't like to use the B word broken lightly. It's one of those terms that you see over on Board Game Geek that is just overused, especially by players who don't really understand the rules or the intention or spirit of the rules. And whenever they come across something that doesn't sit well with them, or is a challenge to them, they just throw up their hands and label the entire game broken. And I resist that for the most part. But with the nature of the problems that were exposed in our playing, I could come to no other conclusion that the game was irretrievably broken. And I, once I identified what the problems were, I wasn't really able to think that I could adapt the rules or house rule the situation to bring things into the proper balance, I guess. I just didn't feel that I knew enough about the subject matter. And so, what are you going to do at that point? But anyway, um, whenever I mention um, that highway is pretty much broken, I get a lot of questions about, well, exactly why. And I found that the reasons are there are two or three major parts of the rules that are woven into the system and the sequence of play in such a way that they can't really be uh, they can't really be taken singly and treated without having some other deleterious effects in the system. They're just it's all kind of woven into a big rat's nest, and that complicates, you know, fixing it or house ruling it. So whenever I bring that up, I'm always kind of pressed on, well, what's wrong with it? You know, I I've played it before, and it was fine, and blah blah blah. But I've always kind of stuttered and said, well, it's kind of complicated. So I'm going to film this in the interest of actually laying out um, what is wrong with the system and showing you some screen grabs from um, our aborted attempt to play the campaign game that shows you what the effects were of the problems. So anyway, the first big problem with Highway to the Reich, if you stray from the historical drop zone model, is that the way the rules are set up, there's not enough risk reward built into the air landing system. And I will, let's see here, try and demonstrate what I mean here. Okay, so first of all, um, I'm going to pop open this thing here and kind of show you where the historical drop zones were that, obviously were well planned out by the Allies in the interest of not imperiling the airborne troops any more than they had to. So we know that most of this area here, which you can see in the yellow hexes, is polder, or kind of a swampy, soft, open terrain, because this is Holland, and the land of canals and marshes and all that other kind of stuff. So it's really not, definitely not good tank country, which complicates 30 Corps moving all the way from this end all the way up here to cross the Rhine in Arnhem. Um, but it also complicates landing airborne troops or glider troops, because you can bring in a glider on polder or swampy ground, and uh, it could just like nose over and kill everybody on board as you're landing. So um, let me show you here, starting from the north. This here is Arnhem, and that's the major prize here is the bridge here across Arnhem, because that crosses the Rhine, and that's the strategic goal of all of Market Garden, was to get the Allied troops across the Rhine River in some form in the fall of 1944, and perhaps end the war by Christmas of 44. So here's Arnhem, and here, a couple of miles away, is where the Allies actually landed the first British airborne, in these really wide pastures here, which are also clear terrain hexes and not the yellow polder. So that's the first big problem for the Allies, is landing here and then traversing through these roads and these suburbs to get to Arnhem before the Germans can react and wake up. Then moving further down, you've got Nijmegen here. Excuse me. And this is a nice sized town with, some suburb areas here, which are not really that suitable for air landing. And so I believe it was the 82nd here, were landed here in this wide area that is clear. Then moving further to the southwest, we have some small towns here, and with bridges, but the drop areas were over here where things were clear, and the American troops, were expected to traverse to these smaller towns and take these bridges here. And here is Eindhoven, the furthest south. And where were the historical drop zones here? Don't actually remember exactly where they were, but these might have actually even had to have been in the polder. I know they didn't drop this far away. And then finally, here's the front line, and where 30 Corps is going to set up and try and break out. Now, if you play this with the possibility that you can use non-historical drop zones, we discovered that the first thing was that the Allies' role, the first thing you do before you start the game, is you go the length of the map and find all of the German flak units, light, heavy, and you roll for disruption via, strikes by, I think, P-47s or, other attack aircraft. And these are mostly likely to result in them being disrupted, which means they cannot put up a flak barrage and hamper the ability of the Allies to bring in the C-47s and the gliders. And the result of that then is that the Allies have the most favorable conditions for landing. And by favorable conditions, I mean they are least likely to scatter or to incur casualties of the troops on landing in the form of, broken ankles and other kinds of injuries. So once you take the flak out of the equation, and in the game that I was speaking of, I would say there were out of the maybe 2 dozen flak units along the length of the map, maybe two of them were left undisrupted by the opening barrage. Um, and so there was an absolute minimum of chance for there to be either scatter or um, casualties. I think maybe there were 3 strength points of casualties for the airborne landing. That's among all 3 divisions for the initial drop. The other effect is because the scatter is minimized so that there's minimal risk of even 1 hex of scatter, it opened up the possibility for the Allies to land very, very, very tightly near their objectives. So, in comparison to choosing an area like this, which has a lot of clear terrain in it, um, you could, for example, go here to Arnhem and land in this area here, which is heavily built up with polder, and incur little risk of scattering into the heavy wooded terrain, which is the broccoli uh, patterned woods here. The light woods, those were okay to land in. You might incur some casualties, but if you ended up in the actual heavy woods, that would basically destroy the unit. Same thing if you landed directly on a urban hex here, that would eliminate the unit. So that was the proper risk reward, but for these large areas of polder, there was no disincentive to try and land there. And that's exactly what the Allies did. Okay, so that's the um, first big problem is that if you stray from the historical drop zone areas, it becomes a little too easy, at least for the opening landings, to land very close to the objectives, which was very ahistorical. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the concept of disruption. And there are some mechanics that are built in to the sequence of play and to the rules for movement and other forms of combat that made disruption basically a death sentence for any unit so afflicted. First of all, in the designer's notes, mention is made of the intention by the designers, that being Jay Nelson and for the second edition rules, Eric Goldberg. They intended that um, if there were any kind of instantaneous overstacking caused by movement and or other forms of combat, the entire stack would be immediately disrupted. So, if you had a hex with a stacking limit of 12 unit or 12 strength points, and you had a unit in it, and then there was another unit on the road, which changes the math a little bit about who can traverse the hex. The minute you tried to move a unit through another one and discover, oops, wait, no, that's an overstack, you were supposed to basically apply the gotcha. No, no, no. Everybody's disrupted, and the unit that was moving into the hex is moved back to the hex before they caused the disrupted, and everybody's disrupted. And secondarily were the actual rules for disruption, which, let's see if I can find what I'm looking for here. Hang on a second. Yeah, here we go. As you can see here, disrupted units cannot perform any functions with the exception of rolling for disruption removal, which is a phase in the middle of the turn. Okay, so disrupted units were basically given a strength, a effectiveness rating, and a morale of effectively 0 for game purposes. So once a unit was disrupted, they were all but dead and they couldn't move. So if you suffer a disruption, um, all you can do is wait for the part of your player turn where you get to roll to remove the disruption, which wasn't wasn't that difficult, provided the unit was of good quality before it was disrupted, and or you had some leaders around that could aid the roll. Yeah, your chances of recovering from disruption were fine. The problem was the chances of your surviving um, in proximity to an enemy were almost always 0. And that's because if um, if the enemy were able to close assault a disrupted unit, they were almost guaranteed to add a second disruption result to that unit that would kill it. And because disrupted units can't move, you had no opportunity to perhaps, move the unit out of the way or off of the line or anything like that. And so, you were quite literally hosed. And let me show you what I mean by that. Um, the way the combat system works is when you when one side launches an attack against the other, you first start on the close action value table where you determine a morale differential. And the morale is I think 1 through 4 rating that is on each of the units in the form of, as you can see, those little triangles at the bottom of the units there. So these are the 9th SS Panzer units, and they have 4 triangles, so they have a morale of 4. Most of the airborne units had either 4s or 3s because they're elite units, and so your rating is 1 through 4, and the morale is cross-referenced with the terrain that you're in. But if you're going up against a disrupted unit, then their morale is 0. So the differential is going to be probably 3 or 4, which gets you to the higher columns here. And then you cross-reference the effectiveness differential, which also is going to be very high because the disrupted unit's effectiveness is 0. So if you have a medium amount of attacking effectiveness, like say 4, That's going to get you a +4 effectiveness differential, which combined with the, say, even modestly, even 3 morale differential is going to get you 7 table, 6 table, 5 table, right? Then after that, you take that value, 5, 6, or 7, your close action value here, and you move that over here to where you find out what the combat strength ratio is. And again, you know, the disrupted unit has a strength of 0. So that means if the attacker has even 1 strength point, he's on the 4-to-1 table. 1 versus 0, it's got to be the maximum. So that puts you over here, and the results here, except for 1 right up here in the corner, have no effect to the attacker. That's the dot. And at the very least, a disruption for the defender. The numbers are strength point losses plus the D for disruption. So you are guaranteed to kill a defending disrupted unit with a close action. So the way the sequence of play works, depending on when it is that you're disrupted, because you can't move a disrupted unit unless your disruption was the result of something going on behind the lines with movement. If they were anywhere in proximity, the other player could move some unit, even the weakest unit, the proverbial old men with bicycles that the Union command was talking about as defending Arnhem. You can bring them in there and launch a close assault, even against a whole stack of strong units and be all but assured of killing that unit. Now, let me show you another aspect that uh, really revealed this big problem in the context of the game. When the game starts here in Arnhem, these very, very hardy units of the 9th SS Panzer are placed here or within 1 hex of these locations, but they are disrupted, not only to start, but for the first 2 turns. They are disrupted. So again, can't move, 0 strength, 0 effectiveness, and 0 morale. Now, you combine that with the non-historical drop zones, and what the British player was able to do in our game was take units from the Red Devils and drop them directly on top of these units. Now, ordinarily against a non-disrupted unit, that would just be a death sentence because, these high effectiveness, 8 effectiveness, high strength in the hex, plus there are penalties if you drop airborne on top of any unit. There are, penalties to effectiveness. You're going to be disrupted, or other penalties make it basically as suicidal as it should be. But in this case, because they're dropping on disrupted units, even after the penalties for dropping on top of enemy units, they still had wide disparities in strength, effectiveness, and morale, and were just basically able to destroy all of these units. And in the bargain, they were able to drop here in the polder very, very close to Arnhem. And now I'm going to show you where these units ended up. after or at the start of turn two. This is Nijmegen. So the Americans were actually able to drop in these areas here really close and dodge these small urban areas and basically take the bridge at Nijmegen and even get across it to put their headquarters here in the suburbs of Nijmegen. Then this is what happened at Arnhem. So as you can see, the 9th SS Panzer is not even there. They were just mopped up right away. And we looked through the rules and we were sure that there was something we had to be overlooking. And we reread those rules time and time again, and nope, we found that there was nothing we were able to do. Um, their deployment was set up to where they could be within 1 hex of here, so we could have put them into the wooded terrain that basically would have been death for the dropping airborne. But the fact that they were disrupted for the first 2 turns meant that even if we had put the tanks here in the heavy woods, the Allied would still be able to drop really close, move in the intervening time, and still be able to close assault the helpless panzers here in the woods. So this was the drop at Arnhem, and this was the drop in Nijmegen. Farther south, it was a a little less terrible because the objectives were um, widely spaced, and uh, the Americans had farther to go. But still, basically, the game was decided on the first turn by dint of being able to swarm Arnhem and set up Nijmegen. And then that brought up uh, the next part of the puzzle, which was supply. The way supply is handled in Highway to the Reich is that all units have to trace to a headquarters unit, which is its conduit for supply. If they're not in the supply, if they can't trace, I think something like 7 to 10 uh, unimpeded hexes from a headquarters to the unit at the instant of firing, they would deplete all their ammo on a roll of 1, 2, or 3 on a 6-sided die. So half the time, every time you shoot, every time you use opportunity fire, direct fire, any kind of fire, you would have to roll for depletion, and the chances are 50-50 that you will deplete. So that was a big issue, and uh, you can see where that would um, that would work for the airborne troops who are basically jumping with their supplies, uh, but for the Germans, their problem is that most of their units are a motley ragtag collection of Luftwaffe units and broken up infantry divisions who were supposedly resting behind the lines. So they tend to have a bunch of headquarter units that are expected to attach other units nearby or somewhere to keep them in supply. But that ignores the fact that the Germans get a significant amount of reinforcements from off map that stream on, and those units, if they don't have headquarter units attached to them, have to move towards a headquarter unit that's on the map and attach themselves to it in order to be effective. So you would figure that the German player would have some sort of provision to be able to trace supply off of one of the map edges here, but that wasn't the case. So that was another issue plaguing the Germans. Um, and so those were the issues. Um, the matter was effectively settled when Arnhem was overrun within 3 hours of the airdrops. Nijmegen, the next town to the south of it, was pretty much in hand too. Then going down here, um, there was really nothing really stopping the Americans from controlling Veghel and Grave and Saint Uterud and Eindhoven. So, yeah, there were some of these also Ninth SS Panzer units here who, of course, have the misfortune of not having a commander nearby. Guess the next ones would be down here closer to the 30 Corps breakout. So, and then the 30 Corps struggle, that was I guess the only mildly bright spot. Um, the Germans were able to um, inflict some casualties on the the British breakout, but the British were also able to launch some airstrikes and disrupt, again, that horrible word, disrupt all the units here in entrenchments. And, so they were having some success, but of course, then they were also hampered by the narrow front rules. Um, but, that was probably the least of the problems for our game session. So anyway, um, it was basically the confluence of the disruption rules and the um, too easy by half airdrop rules for the Allies that made it possible that, you know, Arnhem was definitely not a bridge too far. So that's my wrap up there on why Highway to the Reich should have been titled maybe Highway to the Wreck. Um, as an aside, I know that Derision Games did a reboot of Highway to the Reich, and from what I understand, they've addressed some of the issues in the system, but then, in their usual fashion, introduced some other vexing problems. I never really looked into it just because I have no interest in anything that comes from Derision Games. So, you know, that's another story that I won't go into now. But um, yeah, I don't know what the solution is to any of these problems. Um, it it just seems a shame that a game that was this well regarded turns out to have had so many problems. Um, who knows? Maybe somebody will take up the mantle and will have the expertise and the design skill to maybe find a way to fix what is already here. And I don't know how you uncouple the disruption mechanic from the combat system, from the sequence of play, or just modify the effects of it, maybe, so that maybe strength and effectiveness and morale are halved. Maybe that could make enough of a difference to make it salvageable. I really don't know. But anyway, there it is. All the problems of Highway the Reich in a nutshell. And this has been Stiglr for the details, and we'll see you next time.